Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's 13 games reviewed on the $4,000 2017 edition of the Ultimate System Build Skylake-X i7-7820 8-core 16-thread 4.5 GHz turbo clock speed with 64 GB of DDR4 3200 MHz RAM, not to mention the GTX 1080 Ti graphics card. All of the games you're going to watch today were tested at 4K resolution at varying levels of detail. The performance charts I'll show you at the end of this video will mention which detail level each game was tested at. 8 of the games are live gameplay like what you're watching right now, and 5 of the games were the built-in benchmark. The live gameplay gets 2 minutes each, the built-in benchmark gets about a minute each. We are already about 50 seconds into this, so there's only about a minute 10 seconds left of Assassin's Creed Syndicate. If you want to watch the real-time performance numbers after I've done the intro, you might want to rewind this and watch Assassin's Creed Syndicate again. But I've made these short to keep the video watchable and of a reasonable length. The total amount of time recorded amongst all 13 games was over 3 hours, and nobody wants to watch a 3-hour video, so here we have the short version. First up, we have Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Real-time performance numbers in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. The first line is the GTX 1080 Ti. This is an awesome graphics card. It does have its limitations, even at 4K, but it does a very, very good job here. We're using 100% of the compute power of this card, as we will in most of the games. VRAM usage is just over 5 GB. We are in fact running at high detail at 4K, which is why. Our CPU usage, however, is very respectable. Now, Assassin's Creed Syndicate is variable on CPU usage depending upon where you're at, what you're doing. I've seen this below 25% and I've seen it above 50%. 10 GB of system RAM, and as you can see, over 60 frames per second. And we're already into our next game, Battlefield 1. When you only do 2 minutes per game, they really come fast and furious. Not to worry, more detailed individual videos are being published on my game performance channel. So linked down in the video description below will be a link to all of the games tested on this machine. That actually takes you over to Tech Deals Gaming. There, each video is 1 game per video with an average length of between 7 to 10 minutes per game. The other thing is most of those games will be tested at 1440p. It's not a repeat of these results. And those videos are going to include Ryzen 7 8-core 16-thread comparisons to the Skylake-X 8-core 16-thread, whereas here we're only looking at the performance of this machine at 4K. So it is worth checking out the link down below to the gaming channel if you'd like to see 1440p results and a comparison to Ryzen 7 1800X. While Assassin's Creed Syndicate was at high detail, this is ultra. Yes, we are getting 70 to 80 frames per second at ultra detail 4K resolution on this machine. We are playing a large multiplayer battle, which is very demanding on both the CPU and the graphics card, but it is handling it very well. About 5 GB of VRAM, about 12 to 13 GB of main system RAM. The CPU is bouncing somewhere between 30 to 50% usage in most cases, and as you can see, we are GPU bound. The 99% on the graphics card basically means the reason we're not doing 120 is because even in a well-optimized game like Battlefield 1, the GTX 1080 Ti is the primary limiter to performance at 4K. That's why the further follow-up dates and the comparisons I'm doing is at 1440p, because at 4K, frankly, almost everything is GPU bound. The 1080 Ti is nice, but it's not quite good enough to overcome the limitations of playing at 4K. Moving on from Battlefield 1, we have our first built-in benchmark, Mankind Divided. Now, this is not a game that I personally play or spend much time in, which is why I give you the built-in benchmark. This will be relatively short. I'm not even including the whole thing, but I'm showing you a piece of it just so you can see the real-time frame rate and how well it does. Notice that we are below 60 frames per second. We're also at high detail, not max detail. This game is incredibly crushing, even on a 1080 Ti at 4K. 1440p would be a better choice, or turn some of the detail down. I normally prefer to do performance videos with just live gameplay. I'm not a big fan of built-in benchmarks, but some of the games included here, specifically the 5 that are the built-in benchmark, are included because, frankly, it's this or nothing. I'm not going to play these 5 games individually. Frankly, there's just only so many hours in the day. It does not take very long to run the built-in benchmarks, so I include them for that purpose. Other games like Ghost Recon Wildlands, I do include the actual gameplay even though it has a built-in benchmark. One, I enjoy playing the game. Two, I think it provides a better representation of actual computer use than the built-in benchmark does. A good example is CPU usage. The built-in benchmark in Ghost Recon Wildlands generally uses half the CPU usage of actually playing the game. Frame rates aren't that far off, but the built-in benchmark runs smoothly on lower-end computers that the game does not, so it doesn't really reflect the playability of the game as well as I think it should. And there I went and talked right through the transition to the Far Cry Primal benchmark, which is going to be over in about 15 seconds or so. Another game that I don't play. I played Far Cry 4. I've never actually played Far Cry Primal, but it's got a built-in benchmark, so it's included. Same thing here, For Honor. I got a copy of this game with one of the NVIDIA graphics card promotions earlier in 2017. It has a built-in benchmark. It's quite pretty, but I don't play this game, so it's the built-in benchmark or bust. Now, first, let me apologize for the real-time numbers being so small. This is the only one they're going to be that small because I simply forgot to adjust the size of the font. After testing at 1440p, there's actually a setting you have to go in and adjust the size of it when you switch resolutions or the font size changes. So yes, all of these games have been tested at 1440p as well, but those results are not in this video. Check the gaming channel for those results. Spoiler alert, the frame rate in this particular benchmark nearly doubles. The average and the maximum frame rate are almost twice as much at 1440p as they are at 4K. 4K is incredibly crushing, which is why I'm going to be testing 1440p from now on in most games. Now moving on from For Honor, let's take a look at Ghost Recon Wildlands, one of my favorite 2017 games. It is very demanding, it certainly punishes machines. If you want to play this game at ultra detail, 4K is not going to cut it. Even 1440p is going to be very difficult. I've shown this in ultra detail on the 1080 Ti on my channel in the past. This game is incredibly crushing on ultra. However, very high detail at 1440p is extremely playable on this machine, and of course high detail is crazy good performance. That video is already live over on the gaming channel if you'd like to check it out. But now we're at 4K at high detail. We're at 60 frames a second. It's very nice and very playable. Very smooth performance. This particular game needs this pointed out, even though I said it already in the 1440p comparison video. While it is true that you can get very similar frame rates on an i7-7720K, the truth of the matter is this game is smoother. It feels smoother on an 8-core machine versus a 4-core machine. The interesting thing is it doesn't show up in the actual benchmark results, the minimum, the maximum, the average, the 1% minimum, the 0.1% minimum. The charts are very similar between an 8, a 6, and a 4-core CPU. But having played this game on all these CPUs, having actually driven around and done what you're watching right here, let me tell you, there is a real tangible feel difference in terms of frame pacing between the various processors. Now this is not true of most current games. Most current games are fine on a 4-core 8-thread processor, but it is starting to change. And it's one of those things that you don't really notice until you actually experience it, and then it just stares you in the face. If you've never used anything other than a 4-core processor or a 4-core 8-thread processor, you may be thinking, what's the big deal? The charts look fine, the frame rate's fine, the minimums are fine. Yeah, but once you actually experience it, there's a certain tangible smoothness to the game. It's not about frame rates, it's about frame pacing. Now we move on to Grand Theft Auto 5, a game that loves Intel processors. I have not published the comparison with Ryzen yet using the latest drivers and everything, but that will come up on the gaming channel very soon. This has the largest spread of performance between Ryzen 7 and the i7 of any of the games that I've tested here, simply because this game absolutely loves Intel chips. If you're a GTA 5 fan, Intel or bust. Now we are playing today at very high detail. This game is generally more CPU bound than it is graphics card bound, but very high detail at 4K still stresses the graphics card. That being said, at times you will see that 98% drop down. It did briefly just a second ago, and throughout about the 15 minutes of playtime I put into this, it did drop down in various scenes, but most of the time it is fairly well stressed. Take a look at the CPU usage. We are using way more than 4 cores here. Now at 1080p and to some extent 1440p, it's not as big of a deal. It doesn't use the extra processing power as much. But at 4K, I notice it does kick up. So there is a benefit to having extra cores and extra processing power as you ramp up the resolution. Even though it's still primarily graphics card bound, it does become more demanding overall. So it's smoother, but it is still in fact perfectly playable even at 4K on a 4-core 8-thread i7. It's just nicer on a 6 or 8 core chip. As a side note, now I mentioned this in my individual reviews, take a look at the temperature of the CPU. We're at 55 degrees Celsius. I have the fans on the liquid cooler. Now I do have a 280mm liquid cooler on this processor, but I have the fans turned down to 600 RPM. This machine is utterly silent when I am recording. If you turn those fans up, that temperature drops below 50 degrees. I know some people say Skylake-X is a hot running chip. I'm not finding that to be the case. Even with the CPU overclocked to a fixed 4.5 GHz, I still find the CPU runs around the 65 to 67 degree temperature range under AIDA64 stress testing. In gaming, with the fans turned up to about 1000 RPM, maybe 1100 RPM, it still stays under 60 degrees even at 4.5. Now it is true that if you try to turn it up to 4.7 or 4.8 GHz, then the temperature kind of runs out of control. This is definitely not a 5 GHz processor the way, say, a 7700K is, but at 4.5 fixed, if you don't mind having the fans at between 1000, maybe 1200 RPM, you'll find that temperature is not remotely an issue on the Skylake-X processor. Now, I did talk straight through the transition from GTA 5 to Mass Effect Andromeda, but hey, I figure you can see what's on the screen. Mass Effect Andromeda is an interesting game. Most games, the multiplayer component is more demanding than the single-player component. Yes, there's other exceptions, but for example, Battlefield 1, single-player is far less demanding than multiplayer is. Here, single player is more demanding than multiplayer. So if you're only interested in the single player component, keep in mind you're going to see a performance drop compared to what you're seeing here. Simply walking around on their starship, some of the planets, especially with the higher detail level planets, are going to have lower performance. However, if you take a look at what we have right here, you're still going to get 60 frames per second at high detail, even at 4K resolution. Sadly, Electronic Arts has announced the end of single-player development of this game. Multiplayer will still see some attention, but essentially the reaction was too poor, the sales were too low, and so they're not continuing with the planned trilogy of Mass Effect Andromeda. We're probably not going to see anything further with this game from a story perspective. That doesn't mean there won't be any more Mass Effect games, but they probably will be reboots or set back in the Milky Way galaxy. This kind of didn't really go over very well with audiences. Moving on from that, let's take a look at PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. I've only tested this game a few times, and this is a challenging game to test because there's so many different areas of the map to run around in. Now, I didn't actually do too bad. I'm finding that getting in the top half of the winners list is not that hard to do, just avoid everybody. I ended up number 15 total, so I was ranked number 15 towards the end. But frankly, it was 22 minutes of running around, finding weapons, finding supplies, and not doing very much. I did actually have a match where I got to number 3, and I actually got 2 kills. That's my best match so far, and that was the 1440p test, and that'll end up over on the gaming channel. So if you'd like to see me get a couple of kills and last to the very end, unfortunately the other guy just got a better shot off and managed to kill me. It happens, but I am getting better at it. It is worth noting that the frame rate varies tremendously based upon where you're at in the map and how many people are around you. Here, there's nobody around me. I'm just gathering stuff, and I do this for quite some time. The irony is I ended up with quite an arsenal of weapons. The AK-47 you see in my hands here. I also ended up with an M16. I ended up with a nice pistol, a helmet, a backpack, and a variety of other gear. And I just played it a bit too conservatively, and I ended up dying outside the zone. In other words, that energy field that slowly condenses the play field and forces everybody to play together. Yeah, I kept staying right near the edge of it, and unfortunately it caught me, and I tried to run to stay inside, and I took damage, and finally I got inside, and then I waited too long again, and it killed me again. I think this was my second or third total mission in this game, so I was very, very new. The first one was atrocious. That's already been posted to my channel. But, it's just something to get better at with practice. Now this is PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Another popular title is Rainbow Six Siege, a game that I am not good at whatsoever, which is why the built-in benchmark is being included. I've tried playing this a few times. There are some live gameplay videos on my channel in this game, and I'm terrible at it, so I'm not even going to bother trying anymore. Instead, I'm just including this for those of you who want to see what the performance looks like. As you can see here, it's a nice, comfortable, way above 60 frames per second, and if you want to play this game at 4K, yes you can. The interesting thing about Rainbow Six Siege is that if you turn the detail down, you can actually get much higher frame rates than this, and some people do want that 100 to 144 frames per second if you're a competitive online player, although not that there's very many 144 Hz 4K monitors at the moment. If you set this to 1440p, then you are comfortably in the hundreds of frames per second. Moving on to Rise of the Tomb Raider, same thing. I have done live gameplays in the past. The problem with doing live gameplays with this game is most of my live gameplay performance has been done on this first level, on the Ice Mountain. I have learned, since spending more time with it, that that is not necessarily reflective of the overall performance. I include the built-in benchmark because it includes 3 different scenes in 3 different areas of the game, and the frame rate and the VRAM usage is very different between those 3 areas. That being said, this game is completely playable at 4K with this computer. We have all the CPU power and all the GPU power needed for north of 60 frames per second most of the time. Not all the time, mind you, but most of the time. Now, all you have to do is turn 1 or 2 detail settings down, adjust shadows or anti-aliasing, which frankly you don't need on for this game anyway at 4K because the resolution's so high, but you can make some adjustments and get that above 60 frames per second 99% of the time if that's important to you. Moving on from this game, we have The Division. Now, I test The Division these days in the Underground, the first downloadable content. And this is not the beginning of the mission. I've kind of put it here in one of the battles with a lot of stuff going on to kind of show you the dips that occur during lots of action scenes. Fire, explosions, effects, turrets, etc. Now, the Underground is the first downloadable content and it's player versus environment. I am fully aware of the fact that the Dark Zone, the player versus player area, can see a lower performance than this. So if you are interested in playing in that area, I would strongly encourage you to consider 1440p if you want to maintain these detail settings. Or turn the detail down just a little bit. Turn anti-aliasing off, turn shadows down or off, and then you'll get better performance. Will this maintain over 60 frames per second average at 4K resolution at high detail? Yes, it will. Spoiler alert. But it will not maintain a minimum of 60 frames per second. And if you're a competitive PvPer, if you want to play in the Dark Zone against other real people, then a high frame rate is frankly more important than shiny, pretty graphics. So my encouragement is either turn down the resolution or turn down the detail setting in order to get that frame rate up for competitive online play. The Division is one of the few games in the past year that I've actually completely finished and beaten. The main story is done. In fact, I finished it throughout game performance videos over the past year on my channel, and then I even posted the very final mission to my channel at some point in the past. I don't remember which system it was on at this point because it was months ago, but I did. And so this is, of course, the post-story mission of the game that you're seeing here. And the nice thing about the Underground is it's very repeatable. I can load this up and repeat this over and over in a short, about 10 to 15 minute battle sequence that gives fairly predictable performance. When I used to test above ground, sometimes performance was inconsistent depending upon where in the world you were, but these instanced underground areas tend to be fairly predictable from zone to zone, so that's why I use them. Moving on to World of Warships, one of my absolute favorite games of 2016 and 2017. I have nearly 5,000 battles completed in this game now. I have a bunch of the tier 10 ships and I absolutely love this game. It frustrates me sometimes because of course it's not historically accurate in many respects, and I am very into the historical nature of old World War I and World War II warships. But I also understand that if they made it accurate, frankly, it would be boring, so okay, fair enough. This game is free to play. Go use the link down in my video description below if you're on the North American continent. You will get 2 free premium cash shop ships just for playing the game using a referrer friend link. Now, if you're in Europe or Asia, that link does not work. Unfortunately, it only works in the North American area on the North American servers, but this game is an absolute blast. Cruisers, destroyers, battleships, aircraft carriers. There are hundreds of ships to play absolutely for free, no money required whatsoever. Go give this game a try. Play 10 hours, play 20 hours, don't spend a dime. Granted, Wargaming won't want me to tell you that, but I'm going to tell you that anyway because that's the truth. Play it for 10 or 20 hours. Don't even think about spending money until you decide you really love the game. If you do, yes, there are plenty of ways to spend money on it, but you don't have to. It is completely viable to play this game for free if you want to. Maybe not at tier 10, it's expensive to run those ships, but up to about tier 6 or tier 7, you can play this for free all day long without any problem. I have also recently formed a clan. Clans have been expanded and there's now clan bases. So if you are interested, you can search for Tech Deals Gaming within the client itself, click the join button and start earning some oil for those wonderful expansions, discounted ships, and other benefits. And with that being said, now it's time to look at the benchmark charts. I have two different charts to show you. This first one are the 5 games tested with the built-in benchmark. You can see here that all but Rise of the Tomb Raider were tested at high detail. Rise of the Tomb Raider was tested at very high detail, very playable. Now the chart does have one number that runs off the screen, Rainbow Six Siege, and the reason for that is it had a max of 264 frames per second according to the built-in benchmark. Had I scaled the chart to fit that in, it would have made everything very small and unreadable, which is why you see the 264 max right there in the description and it runs off the page. This way you can see all the numbers much easier. Now these are minimum, maximum, and average frame performance numbers rather than 1% and 0.1% because I'm using the game's built-in benchmark. I am not actually running a fraps run on these. It's not long enough really to make a 1% run mean anything. You need a longer gameplay, 5 or 10 minutes, for that to really stand out. The short version here, everything is playable except maybe Mankind Divided, which is pretty rough, down at 41 frames per second average at 4K high detail. Either turn a couple of the detail settings down or turn the resolution down. That game is always very rough on the built-in benchmark. Everything else is just fine at high or very high detail at 4K. Now that brings us to the 8 games tested with live gameplay. Yes, there's a lot of numbers on the screen. First of all, Battlefield 1 Ultra Detail, GTA 5 and World of Warships very high. Everything else was tested at high detail. Every game here averaged about 60 frames per second, some of them well north of that. But the minimums, the 1% and the 0.1% minimums, were definitely not there. Notice PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, 59 frames per second average, and that was over a more than 20-minute gameplay run, and I wasn't even doing a lot in that game. That game is absolutely crushing to computers. If you want to play at 4K, yeah, you really need a 1080 Ti, at least at high detail. Now, if you turn the detail down, you don't need as much. But notice that the 0.1% and the 1% minimums were down in the 24 to 33 range. Most of the games were not this bad. Assassin's Creed Syndicate, for example, did dip down to 30 very briefly. But that was a fairly decent run, and the 1% minimum was 57. Absolutely. Would I play Assassin's Creed Syndicate at high detail 4K on this machine? I would. I never saw that 30. It was in there somewhere, but frankly, it was smooth 60 frames per second 99% of the time. Likewise, The Division, Mass Effect Andromeda, World of Warships, and certainly GTA 5. Look at GTA 5. Even its 0.1% minimum was about 60 frames per second, and it was over 100 frames per second a lot of the time. GTA 5 runs really well on this computer. As I said before, be sure to check all the links in the video description below. They'll take you to the 1440p playlist over on the Tech Deals Gaming channel. They'll also take you to the full build video series on this computer, the assembly of the machine, the parts overview, a parts comparison, and alternative suggestion video. That's all going to be down there as well. Non-game performance tests are coming up soon as well. Thank you so much for watching. Click that like button, share this video with your friends. Remember to subscribe for notifications of upcoming videos. Check the links down in the video description for everything talked about in this video. please consider supporting me on Patreon for more great videos like this. I'm starting to do early access releases of videos like this. This video will go live for my Patreons before it goes live to the general public. If you'd like to get early access to my videos, please consider supporting me, link down in the video description below. Thank you so much for watching. I will see all of you next time.